Hello, you beautiful, awakened, and evolving souls. Welcome to this space and time. My name is Gabriel Lugo, and here I will be talking from self to self, which is a beautiful way to remind us that there is only one being in this universe, and I find it amazing that we can simply talk about oneself. And in this case, I am literally talking to myself, which is you, my other self. So just another reminder of our unity. This podcast is something that has been in the mind works, if you will, for over 2 years. And please don't ask me why I haven't done this already. But this is the day, finally. And I wanted to give this introductory episode as the first one to talk a little bit about myself in a way that I don't think I have spoken before, and that is, of course, relevant to this initiative that I had to continue to communicate with you people who are the closest brothers and sisters that I have in philosophical terms, and simply because I just can't have enough of me expressing who I am. And this brings me to my first item, which is my desire for communication is something that has been a passion of mine since I was a child, and something that certainly after I had my liberation of my, not only my spiritual awakening, which literally was a way for me to awaken to the reality that there is something called a spiritual realm, that there is something beyond the physical, but also from the liberation of my own mind, which is something that I just hope to encourage as many people as possible to approach this possibility of being liberated from one's mind, which sounds a little strange for the majority of us, because how can we be prisoners of our own minds? But when you get to study your mind, to observe your mind, you start to realize that you have been your own warden, so to speak, into doing the things that you love. Now, of course, I'm speaking anecdotally here, by experience, because when I mentioned just now that my life has taken a turn to communicate what I'm passionate about, which is these views of the world, these views about reality. If I can describe in one phrase what I am and what I love to do, is to talk about reality, to express my views of reality. And I think this is something that we're all passionate about in one way or another. We may use different forms of expression, but we are all inevitably attracted to the expression of our views of this life, of this amazing and infinite reality that we experience second by second. And so I think this is a fair description of who I am right now, given my recent evolution and my different awakenings, or the different changes that have happened to me, my evolution in general, is that I simply want to communicate this. Now, this beautifully brings me to my second point, which is, what is it that I want to communicate? Well, most of you know me for my work with the raw material, also known as the Law of One. And this is a big portion, for sure, of my views of reality, of the stimulus that helps me create a model of what we know as the physical and the metaphysical, which creates, in essence, the creation. It makes up the creation. But also what we know as non-duality, which in our Eastern philosophies is known grossly as Buddhism or the awakening. And this is something that naturally occurred over time, just like the law of one was adapted to my views of the world and the universe in general, because of how easily it was to absorb it, to digest it, to relate to it, and actually to make it seem like an everyday thing. It was applicable to anything intuitively. In the same way, when I was exposed to non-duality as distinct from many other belief systems and philosophies in general, this just started to make click in me. Although it was completely foreign to my Western mind, it was totally opposite to what I was indoctrinated to believe. Yet, it was resonating within myself that this was the purest form that we have up to date, which is not a dogma, and this is not something that should be taken dogmatic, much like the law of one should not be taken dogmatic, or anything for that matter, but is something that is also in evolution. And I think that's the beauty of non-duality, that it's not something that was created so people can follow it blindly. Rather, it has been something that has evolved and it has taken so many forms, and there is no conflict. They all follow the same principles. And that is just something that resonates with me, and I think was the reason why I became more scientific. And I think that's the reason why most of us became more scientific, is because we simply didn't want to conform with what certain authorities would talk about reality, namely religious belief systems, where we were told that things were this way and we couldn't deviate from that, let alone talk about the victimhood that we were and the sinners that we have become simply for being alive. And these things simply were obsolete to our mind and the way we were thinking and living. And so science became this open field for us to observe reality. Now, of course, over time it has become very dogmatic, and it has become something that we must be careful of, lest we become, like I was, a religious fanatic in terms of science. I was, my science was, or my religion was science, and that's because I couldn't take anything that would challenge it, because I would call it pseudoscience. And so, for the same reason that science was so beautiful to me at the beginning, then non-duality has become something for that, for the study of the mind. And you see, the difference here, and I think it's the crucial difference, is that this is not a science that you need to learn in order to apply it. And when I mean learn, I mean it externally, but rather is a science that you develop on your own experience, due to your own investigation. And this is what is called the inner path, the self-inquiry that we engage in for the realization of the self. The beauty that also overlaps with non-duality is that the law of one is probably the sophisticated way to talk about non-duality, hence why we have the name the law of one, which literally just means non-duality, or Advaita, non-dual, not two. And with this sophisticated way of looking at reality comes, of course, something that Buddhism in its most strict form lacks, which is the explanation of the metaphysical, the exploration of the other side of the coin, which is physical. Because you see, non-duality in general deals with the exploration of the mind and consciousness, which is the ultimate reality. Consciousness is the ultimate reality. Consciousness is the creator in you. You are conscious. That's your way to check that you are the creator. And so the Law of One explores in more details the marriage between the physical realm and the metaphysical realm, while of course taking us by the hand through non-duality and the exploration of the self. And the material, the raw material in specific, is just to me one of the most perfect teachings that we have, with its own imperfections as it's expected. Otherwise it wouldn't be part of this reality. But there's also more to explore within the Law of One, and if you know me, you know that I have a great affinity for the source of the Law of One, which is L&L Research. I think they have done a beautiful work over the decades. It's been already really 50 years since they, or close to 50 years since they had their research into UFOs and then rapidly into communication with higher density beings. And so this seems to explain a little bit more, and you can see that I'm very eclectic here when it comes to electing where I get my views of reality. I don't try to subscribe to just one belief system, because I think that's where the magic dies and we become indoctrinated into something. And so with that in mind, I explore as much as possible. And these two philosophies, or these two belief systems, which is not really a belief system, but just these two teachings that we have, are a huge influence in my life. And so that's something to be obviously expected from my work in this podcast and in anything else, as you well know. So, however, these are all teachings, and while I love talking about them, there is an element that I always include in all of my expressions, which is my experience, my visions, who I believe I am in this skin while viewing the universe. And there is a word that needs to be addressed here before anything else, which is the word enlightenment. You see, enlightenment seems to be reserved for people who deserve a title for living in a way that is very inspiring for others. And while this may be true in one sense, I think that at the same time there is a sort of shyness to this word when people become enlightened. And it's almost like taboo to say, I have become enlightened, which is a false modesty, a denial of our own experience when we have explored what is a mystical experience. For sure, this is not to say that everybody who has a mystical experience and becomes aware of this other side of reality is enlightened. I don't think we can call anybody enlightened, but you yourself can understand what enlightenment is, and without the need to express it and say I am enlightened, know that you're living a path of enlightenment, if that's a better way to phrase it. But not to get entangled with words and meanings and definitions and titles, the purpose of this word being so important for me to discuss right now is that enlightenment simply means the shining of the inner light into the external world which is where you have been projecting yourself. And so this light shines upon the illusory aspects of yourself, showing you their false beingness, their ghost qualities. And at the same time, it encourages this self-inquiry into what this light is that keeps shining from us. This inner light is what we would call enlightenment, and the path to enlightenment or of enlightenment can easily be said to be the ways in which we live our lives through this consciousness, through this knowledge, even through these visions and perception of reality. And so the question really isn't if you have been enlightened, but how much are you following this path of enlightenment once you have seen the light? And I believe that's just a more descriptive and succinct way of putting what it is to be awakened, in the sense of Buddhism and in the sense of the law of one as well. To be a Buddha, to shine or live from our Buddhic nature. And this, of course, brings up to the point of liberation, which is a word that I believe we should use a lot more when we refer to ourselves as evolving souls. It's a liberation from the mind. I won't get into the nuances of what the mind is here, but the mind being a finite resource of consciousness to explore itself, the path of enlightenment is the liberation of the mind. And the mind is concerned with limitations, with blocks, with categories, with identities. When we talk about liberation of the mind, we're talking about liberation from identities, from what we think we are, because thinking is already an act of separation. Therefore, silence is the greatest teacher, because silence has no separation. Silence is, in essence, our true nature. And so liberation of the mind is something that is the purpose of all of this, is to know that this doesn't mean, and this is something that needs to be always emphasized, this doesn't mean that liberation of the mind means that you won't have a mind anymore, that you will give up your mind and be mindless, which is, I think, a trap and a mistake that has happened in the past and continues to happen, but rather is a liberation from the association of ourselves with the mind. And this further includes the path of enlightenment as the way, because the liberation of the mind means that we can stop identifying ourselves with the mind and shine more from the inner light that we are. And so that's another purpose that is present in my philosophies, that you will certainly be listening to in one shape or another in this podcast, and certainly in any other of my content. And lastly, I think going to just to finish up the word of illumination. Once again, illumination, enlightenment, realization of the self is simply the recognition of the egoic self that we have been indoctrinated in believing we are, and building our structure over. And when I mean our structure, I mean our whole global structure is based on a separate self. And through this recognition of the separate self, or the egoic self, we start to reveal the permanent self, that inner light of what we are. And this is, again, one of my deepest and more passionate desires, which is to simply share with you and communicate to you anything that I may come up with or find in the ways of scriptures or channelings or teachings or simply information that we can use. I can honestly sit down here and read Alice in Wonderland and talk about non-duality and the law of one. I can discuss Star Wars and extract something to talk about the same concepts, because this is permeated in all reality. I can grab up a leaf and talk about it for an hour on the nature of reality, because we're not enclosed into specific teachings and scriptures, but rather information in general. So this is just, like I said, an introductory way to say, this is what you should expect from me. This is what's exuding out of this mind, body, spirit complex that I am. And hey, if this is something that you're interested in, I hope you stay tuned in with this new way for me to communicate myself, because like I said at the beginning, I cannot stop it. This is just who I am, and this is what's coming out from this co-creator, this brother that I am for you. I want to thank you as usual for listening, for simply being, and for being part of this beautiful reality that we are beginning to appreciate even more and more as time goes on. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye for now. I hope you stay in harmony, love, peace, and honestly just an open appreciation of everything that your life is. Because whether you know it or not, your life is perfect. It's an epic story, and I'm here to share it with you. Thank you, and I'll talk to you in the next one.